Greetings and welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It's Monday, June 23rd, 2025, and on Mondays we talk about mathematics and statistics. Some of you will already know that the theme for the Dr. J Vlog series this week is peace, broadly speaking. And so that means I'll be addressing the issue of peace for 7 consecutive days from 7 different perspectives in accordance with the themes of the Dr. J Vlog series. So yesterday I discussed peace in relation to the purpose and meaning of life. And so today I'll be discussing the issue of peace from a statistical standpoint. That's right. In particular, for the last couple of decades, the Institute for Economics and Peace, based in Sydney, Australia, has been publishing the Global Peace Index, or GPI. So the 2025 GPI was just published last week. So that's just about perfect timing for us. So what's the GPI? Well, simply put, it's a ranking of 163 countries across the world. And those 163 countries contain 99.7% of the world's population. So it's mostly everybody. And so they rank the 163 countries then from the most peaceful to the least peaceful. So what does that mean? Well, the GPI comprises 23 separate indicators that measure the absence of violence or fear of violence. And the 23 indicators were originally selected by an expert panel back in 2007, and then they're reviewed by an expert panel annually. And the all scores for each of the indicators are normalized on a scale of 1 to 5. The qualitative indicators are then banded together into 5 different groupings. The quantitative indicators are actually scored from 1 to 5 up to the 3rd decimal point. So in total, there are 3 different domains that are then combined to form the overall peace index score. So in the first domain, there are actually 6 unique indicators of ongoing domestic and international conflicts that are afflicting each of the 163 countries. So for example, the number and duration of internal conflicts, the number of deaths from internal organized conflicts, and so on. And then there are 11 measures of each country's societal safety and security. So for example, political instability, homicide rates per 100,000 population, and again, several others. And then finally, the 3rd domain refers to militarization. So there are 6 different measures of militarization. So for example, military expenditures as a percentage of GDP, the number of armed services personnel per 100,000 population, and so on. So the indicators are then weighted and ultimately combined to produce one overall score for each country, and then they're all ranked. So they give really excellent details on the methodology in the full report. I'll leave a link in the description below if you're interested. But it's truly a remarkable feat in terms of the data collection and the many different sources, the best sources we have at our disposal to track systematically what's happening and so on. I'm doing this for, again, the better part now of 2 decades. And so the final report each year offers the most comprehensive data-driven analysis to date on trends in terms of peace and even the economic value associated thereon, and also factors that are influencing the peaceful development of societies or the relative lack thereof. So it's an excellent report each year. And the 2025 GPI finds that, unfortunately, peacefulness has continued to decline in recent years, with many of the leading factors that precede major conflicts higher than they have been at any time since the end of the Second World War. And the average level of peacefulness across all societies has declined again for the 7th consecutive year. Most countries are increasing their levels of militarization as geopolitical tensions rise. Conflicts have been increasing overall across the globe. Traditional alliances in some cases have been breaking up. And then economic uncertainty has been a factor too. So all of this is examined in much greater depth and detail. So for example, there are currently 59 active state-based conflicts. And that's the most since the end of World War II. And it's 3 more than the previous year. So again, this data is all based on 2024. The previous year would be 2023. So last year then, 17 countries around the world also recorded over 1,000 conflict deaths. Additionally, the successful resolution of conflicts is lower than at any point in the last 50 years. In other words, so for example, conflicts that ended in a decisive victory fell from 49% in the 1970s to only 9% in the 2010s. Conflicts that ended through peace agreements fell from 23%, again in that period, to just from the 1970s to just 4% over the 2010s. Also, conflicts are increasingly international in nature, as 78 countries are currently engaged in a conflict beyond their borders. And guess what? As you probably know, that number has just gone up. Okay, so here are a few more factoids from the study. There were 4 indicators with average deteriorations of over 2% in just the past year alone. And these included external conflicts fought, deaths from internal conflicts, military expenditures, and weapons imports. Okay, there were 98 countries that were at least partially involved in some form of an external conflict over the past 5 years in total. And that's up from 59 back in 2008. In most cases, countries were offering support to an existing government against armed rebels or terrorist groups. And by the way, the organization also produces the Global Terrorism Index as well. So the Global Peace Index and the Global Terrorism Index. I use that, of course, that is the Global Terrorism Index for the course that I teach on terrorism and the book that I'm almost finished with writing. That's another story for another day. Okay, in addition, military expenditures as a percentage of gross domestic product, GDP, recorded the second largest yearly deterioration since the inception of the GPI. So in other words, 84 different countries increased their relative military expenditures compared to just 50 where it decreased. There were 17 countries with over 1,000 internal conflict deaths in 2024, and that's the highest number since 1999, and a further 18 countries that recorded over 100 deaths in the last year. And then on average, the level of global peacefulness deteriorated in the aggregate by just over 1/3 of 1%, 0.36. And so that's the 13th deterioration in peacefulness in the last 17 years. In total, 74 countries improved, 87 countries deteriorated, 2 were unchanged over the last year. Of course, there's far more information in the report, so I'm being highly selective. So let's now cut to the chase, shall we? What would you guess is the most peaceful country in the world, at least as measured by the GPI? What's the number 1 ranked country? Any guesses? I'll give you a hint. It has been in the top spot for 17 consecutive years. Still don't know? It's Iceland. So that's where you want to plan your next vacation if you're looking for a safe and peaceful country to visit. All right, so I'm actually going to share with you now a chart that lists the top 20 countries in terms of their GPI rankings. All right. And note it's a bit like golf. That is to say, the lower your score, the better. And so if you're looking at this chart, and again, I apologize if you're listening to this or looking at it on a phone, but the GPI rankings then, as I say, they're compiled into one overall aggregate score. The lower your score, the better. And then on the chart that's presented there, I've given the names of the top 20 countries at the bottom, the x-axis, and then on the y-axis, you see the overall scores out to 3 decimal places. All right, and so that means Iceland is ranked number 1, and you'll see their overall GPI ranking is 1.095. So that's the lowest of the 163 countries. In second place is Ireland at 1.260. In third, it's New Zealand at 1.282, and so on. You'll note, if you're especially from Canada, and I think the majority of my listeners are still from Canada, although I have a bit of a following in the States and elsewhere, but Canada is currently ranked 14th and tied, you can see on the chart there, with the Netherlands. Holland. So yeah, we're 14th with Holland at 1.491. So that's pretty good. We're in the top 20. And then, rounding out the top 20, Germany is there in at 20th. Okay, so anyone listening perhaps from the United States? Well, how y'all doing in terms of the GPI? Well, the U.S. position has not changed since last year. That's a good thing. That's the good news. The bad news is that the U.S. is still ranked, drum roll, 128th. Yep. The U.S. is ranked 128 out of 163 countries with a cumulative score of the GPI of 2.443. So that's not great. And in addition, they have these different cutoff points, which are a bit subjective, of course, but each country then is sort of descriptively placed into one of 5 overall categories in terms of their state of peace. The highest category, the best category, being very high, so very high state of peace. Second category, high. Third category, medium. Fourth category, low. Fifth category, very low. So just to be clear, the top 12 countries, and again, I've left them up on the screen there, from Iceland through Japan, those 12 countries all made the cut for being adjudged as having a very high state of peace. Canada just missed that particular cut, so they won't be playing on the weekend. No, but we're at the top end of the high state of peace ranking. So that's pretty good. We can just nudge it up a little bit further. The United States, by the way, just missed out on the cut for the middle category, for the medium cutoff. And so they're ranked now, currently, at least for the, based on the 2024 data, they're ranked at the sort of the top end of the low category, the 4th out of 5 categories. So that's not great, but of course it could be worse. And so if we go to the other end of the spectrum, we have the bottom 15 countries, the ones that are worse off. And in fact, all 15 of these countries, these are the 15 countries that make up the very low state of peace category. I don't have a chart. I didn't put them in a chart, but nonetheless, so again, out of 163 countries, we're looking at the bottom 15 now. So ranked 149th, North Korea, okay, and then followed by the Central African Republic, Somalia, Burkina Faso, Myanmar, Mali, Israel is ranked 155th, South Sudan, 156th, Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen, Democratic Republic of Congo, and then the bottom 3 countries are number 161 is Sudan. And do you know what the lowest of the numbers 162 and 163 are? Again, I bet you can guess. Do you think of any major wars that are happening in the world currently? Well, maybe a few, but the biggest has been Ukraine and Russia. So Ukraine's ranked 162. Their overall GPI score is 3.434, and Russia is ranked at the very bottom at 3.441. Okay, interesting stuff. Wouldn't you agree? All right, just a few more noteworthy trends, though. So global stability has, in general, deteriorated over the past 17 years, marked by substantial increases then in political instability, the number and intensity of conflicts, and the deaths from these conflicts. So we have some really good hard data monitoring stuff. Again, it's not perfect, but it's pretty good. Peace has deteriorated every year since, actually all the way going back to 2014. And over this period, 100 countries have deteriorated as compared with 62 that have improved, at least somewhat, at least from a decade ago, shall we say. And the gap between the most and the least peaceful countries, unfortunately, continues to grow, with the peace inequality, is a phrase they use, widening by almost 12% in the last 2 decades. The one GPI domain that's experienced especially significant deterioration, again, remember there's these 3 different domains, but the one that's really gone down a fair bit since 2008 would be the realm of ongoing conflict and safety and security. So that's down almost 18% overall since 2008. And then across the 23 GPI indicators in total, external conflicts fought and internal conflicts fought had the largest deteriorations last year. And again, this is reflective then of the general spread of conflicts around the world, as well as the increasing involvement of external actors in civil conflicts, aiding and abetting in various ways and so on. And then also overall, deaths from internal conflicts increased by 438% over the last 17-year span, with 75 countries recording at least 1 conflict death in the past year. And then around the world, there are now over 122 million people who have been forcibly displaced. Again, remember, in a population of just over 8 billion, 122 million have been forcibly displaced. And there are now 17 countries where over 5% of the total population is comprised, or they're either refugees or they're people who've been internally displaced. The number of people who have been forcibly displaced, I should say, has increased by a whopping 185% since the inception of the GPI. And then last year, global military spending hit a record $2.7 trillion. And that's a 9% increase from the previous year, driven especially, of course, by the war in Ukraine. And finally, in speaking of money, what's the global economic impact of violence? Yeah, we can measure that too. So last year, again, in 2024, the total impact, the economic impact, was $20 trillion. Trillion, not billion, $20 trillion in constant dollars, equivalent to almost 12% of the global or the total GDP for the entire world, or $2,455 per person. The 2024 results represent an increase of 3.8% from the previous year, largely driven by a 6% increase in military expenditures, and then also a 44% increase in GDP losses from conflict. Afghanistan and Ukraine incurred the highest economic cost of violence, at least as measured by a percentage of their GDPs. And the economic cost of violence in these countries was essentially over 40% of their GDP. So that's absolutely devastating. And then in the 10 countries that are most affected by violence, the economic cost of violence averaged almost 28% of their GDPs in 2024, and that's compared with only about 2.5% for the 10 countries least affected by violence. Expenditures, by the way, on there's just a couple more that I find interesting. Expenditures on peace building and peacekeeping was only $47 billion in 2024, and so that's just over a half of 1%, 0.52, of total military spending. Quite a difference. And by the way, this also represents a real decline, again, adjusting for inflation, of 26% from the $64 billion spent in 2008. So, unfortunately, I guess you could say I'm the bearer of some rather bad news or disheartening news today, shall we say, based on the newest information from the Global Peace Index, the GPI. But again, we have to report the facts and then engage in meaningful dialogues. Remember, none of these figures, the rates, the conflicts, the expenditures, and so forth, none of that's fixed or immutable or unchangeable. So, while I mostly, myself, focus on the positive and the inspirational messaging, especially with the Dr. J vlog, I also have to be a realist, too, in terms of sharing with you folks the best scientific information that we have at our disposal on the different issues that we address here. And especially those that affect so many people, right? Like climate change and like the Global Peace Index. So we have to confront real scientific facts and assess the best information that we have at our disposal, in my view. That's my purpose, at least, with the vlog. And then the information has to be updated. And if we find errors, we have to improve upon the information. We try to correct our misunderstandings and so on. And then once we have the data, the great news here is that we can then go much further. We can then start to, and this is again part of the point of the Dr. J vlog series, we can then continue to do a deeper dive into the whys of the patterns that we discover, and then discuss the key forces and mechanisms that are at play. And you've heard the expression that knowledge is power, right? Well, precisely. And so I want to share with y'all the best information and ideas that we have at our disposal on these issues. And then each of you and the collective we can be more empowered. And then we're in a better position, if you will, to change the world, if you feel like we need to do that. All right, but we'll also spend some time each week, especially on Tuesdays and Saturdays, looking at music and the arts and sports and humor, so we can talk about all this stuff from different angles and sometimes have a little bit more fun and relax and enjoy the information, especially when we're dealing with the more difficult issues, shall we say. Sometimes we can find inspiration in music and the arts and sports and so on, and that's why I include those sessions as well. Cool? All right, well, as ever, may you and yours continue to create peace, the theme of the week. Create peace in your lives, nurture love in your hearts, and dole out hugs in abundance. And then tomorrow, let's get inspired with music and the arts and talking about peace. See you then.